So, when I was young, I grew up in 4 different countries, and there was a period of time where we would actually move between them every year, you know, twice a year, kind of between different ones. And so it was a lot of moving and a lot of living in different countries. And I was born in Norway, so one of those 4 places was United States, so I was a foreigner in this country. And I had this strong wish at the time that I didn't tell anyone. It was something I thought about in my mind. I really wished I could get a United Nations passport. I had heard there was such a thing, and excited. I didn't want to. I wanted to belong to the whole world. I didn't feel like I wanted to belong to any particular country, but just be global, belong everywhere. And some of that was born from seeing the divisiveness that happened between countries, and growing up with parents and grandparents who went through World War II, and I was young. I was young enough in the '60s to really still experience the after effect of World War II and the divisions between countries. And so this idea of, kind of choosing your country against other countries was kind of very painful, living in these divisions. So that was kind of my wish. And now I've been here in the peninsula, living here for 30 years, about, I guess 28 years, I think, living here, but 33 years of being here, because I started going to school at Stanford in 1990. And one of the great delights for me living here in the peninsula is how over these years I've gotten increasingly cosmopolitan. So maybe I don't have to have an international passport. I just live here and appreciate more and more diversity of people from all over the world who come here, and diversity within this country. And I feel like it's much richer, and I also feel like it's, for me personally, much safer to live in a diverse community. And the representation of that was in all these kind of jumping around and all this I did. When I was 20, I lived for 4 months in the biggest hippie commune in the United States. It was 700 people who lived on a place called The Farm in Tennessee. And how a bunch of Haight-Ashbury hippies ended up in Tennessee is a whole, story. And when they were in Haight-Ashbury, or this locally in the 60s, LSD was kind of like the sacrament for this group of people. They had kind of a spiritual bent, and of sorts. But they went to Tennessee. It didn't really work well to take a lot of LSD in Tennessee back then. So when I came there to visit for a few days, actually the leadership of the community was in jail for a year because of such things. And but it was a year, and they came out while I was still there. And so they had to find another way of, they had we can't do LSD anymore here. We have to find something equivalent we can do that's legal. And the amazing thing they came upon was honesty. Isn't that pretty cool? That honesty is, equivalent to LSD. Now there's a resurgence of psychedelic interests in society, but I haven't seen the same resurgence of honesty. But if honesty and psychedelics are equivalent, let's get high on honesty. So I was so impressed by this. This really blew me away, and that seeing how this community had developed capacities to have these honest conversations was the reason I stayed more than 2 or 3 days. And I stayed for 4 months and learned a lot from them. Was inspired. It was actually my introduction to spirituality. I had no background in religion or spirituality before that, but that was a doorway into the spiritual kind of world, was that people who were exploring honesty. But the reason I left was that it was a homogeneous culture for the most part. There were all these people like me, white, middle-class hippies. And I'd grown up so many different cultures that I didn't feel safe to be around people who were too much like me. And so I left because of that reason. And some people would have stayed because they feel comforted by that and feel like now I belong and now we're all right together. But I actually felt that's not quite right to do that. So because it's very easy to end up with a very strong us versus them. And recently in this training I'll tell you about, they gave an example of this, of sports. And apparently there's a phenomena, kind of a double standard, that if the referee or the umpire kind of is a little bit ambiguous whether the call was right, but it's for your team that they got the call was right, then well, that must be right. But if it is your team and the call is ambiguous, but it's but the umpire, the referee says it's wrong, then people get really upset. The opposite for the other team. If the other team is ambiguous, but the referee says it's right, it was legal, the game, then we get upset because it's the other team. They have it wrong, the referees have it all wrong, they need to get new referees. But if the referee says they're wrong, there's a penalty, then yeah, of course, So there's a double bind there, that more likely there's a bias towards forgiving or seeing the rightness of your own group and the wrongness of another group. And so you see that because I've seen people it's dramatic watching people watch sports, and how strongly their opinions can be and how outraged they can be about these referees when they're against their own team. So that's kind of representative of kind of deep kind of bias that can operate in people when we have us versus them. So I kind of feel uncomfortable for a little bit watching. Even I am kind of weird, I guess, maybe for societal standards. The competitive sports is kind of strange to me, and I kind of mostly root for the person who's losing. Then I want that, and I like it in soccer where you can come out even, 0-0 or 1-1, and that I like that. And when I was in college in the 70s, there was a little movement of I forget what it was called, alternative games that people played that were not, whole books written about it, these fun games you could play that were not competitive. So maybe that kind of is wonderful, and also we lose something in the process. But so I want to read, so I want to tell you a little bit about this training we did for about 30 of us here at IMC, did a training called Deep Diversity. And here at IMC, we've spent a lot of time looking at diversity, equity, inclusion issues. And have read, some of us have read a lot about this, some here at IMC much more than me. And we've kind of settled on a particular approach to this DEI work that really we feel works for who we are. And that's, we found it through a book called Deep Diversity. And Deep Diversity the author was co-founded an organization called the Anima Leadership, just called Anima Leadership Organization, or something, institute or something. It doesn't have a third word. And they offer trainings. And so 30 of us did the training, and it was quite wonderful, I thought, 2 weeks ago. And at various times we've had book groups here at IMC reading this book, Deep Diversity, and with some of our Sangha leaders kind of leading the discussions. And so we're going to bring more of this deep diversity to IMC. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this, and I wanted to do it the best I can in the context of our practice and what we do here dharmically. So I want to begin with a sutta, begin or continue with the sutta discourse of the teachings of the Buddha, where someone came to the Buddha and said, there are these 4 castes. The king, there are these 4 castes: the nobles, the Brahmins, the merchants, and the workers. 2 of them, that is, the nobles and the Brahmins, are held to be superior, since people pay homage to them, rise up for them, and accord them reverential salutation and polite services. So, are there people like that in this country? People for whom are held to be superior, and people pay homage, give them more respect than other people, rise up for them when they come, kind of listen to them more. Their voices are more important than other voices. Are there people in this country who are reverentially saluted and people who are not? And polite services, people who get preferential services. Periodically I hear from people who say, yeah, I went to a store and the person there just ignored me. I was there first, I was in line first, and I just felt like I was invisible. Sometimes people get older, they say, I feel invisible in society. People just overlook me for that reason. And people racially are ignored. And I remember going to Costco to get new tires for my car. And there was a black woman sitting there, and I came in later. And the clerk came to me. So I turned to the woman and said, were you here first? And she said, yes, but then she explained. She seemed okay with it, and then we became friends. It was very nice. But to see this kind of thing over and over again, it's quite something in our society that can happen. So they might not be Brahmins and merchants, noble people, but still we have enough of this in our society that I think we can recognize some of this. So maybe the question is almost like, are these distinctions existing here in our society in some way, similar? So there's a recognition of these different castes, and then the question is there a distinction or difference among them? So the caste system in India is taken for granted. What's the distinction and difference between them? So this is the Buddha's answers. He answers indirectly first. He says, there are 5 abilities for efforting, 5 efforts we can engage in. We have the ability to awaken faith, confidence, trust, deep trust in something. And then he gives the example that trust the capacity for human beings to become enlightened, to become free, to become liberated of their suffering. So it's possible to have deep faith in that. That's the first he says. The second is it's possible to work for, make the efforts for, becoming healthy. And that's problematic just the way it's worded here. But sometimes people don't get healthy physically, but you can get spiritually healthy, even if you're chronically ill. But there can be effort towards some kind of health. There's efforts to be honest and sincere. That's something we have the ability to do that. One is honest and sincere. One shows oneself as one actually is to one's teacher and one's companions in the spiritual life. The next one, the fourth one, is one can be energetic. One can really put effort into abandoning the unhelpful things that we do. So there's plenty of people who do unhelpful things, even harmful things, unskillful things. And sometimes it's called in Buddhism unwholesome things. I like to call it unhealthy because it's easier to identify with it. But sometimes what we do is unhealthy for other people, not just for ourselves. But to make an effort to stop doing that, Stop doing things which are unhealthy. We have that ability. And we have the ability to undertake the helpful things, the helpful, wholesome, skillful things to do. And to be steadfast and firm and persevering in cultivating these healthy things to do. So we have that capacity, the ability. And then the fifth one, we have the ability to be wise. And in particular, we have the ability to be wise about how radically changeable this reality we live in is, our experience, human life is, how much change there is. And whether it's change moment by moment or change year by year, societies change. All kinds of things change. And it's recognizing that change for Buddhists that is the catalyst for spiritual liberation, which leads to the complete destruction, complete end of our own psychological suffering. So we have these abilities. So ability to develop faith, to develop some kind of health, to develop honesty, to develop, to let go of unskillful, develop skillful, and have this wisdom about the changing nature of our experience. So that's what Buddha's first answer about the distinctions between people. He hasn't answered the question yet, but he's setting the stage for it. Then the Buddha says, so there certainly are these four castes: nobles, the Brahmins, the merchants, and the workers. Now, if they possess these five factors, would there be any difference among them in this respect? So first he established these five things people can do, abilities. Then he says, what's the difference between them? What distinctions can we make between them in these 5 degrees? And then he makes the analogy. There are elephants and horses and oxen that can be well tamed. They have the ability to be tamed, the capacity to be tamed. And if there are 2 oxen, 2 horses and elephants have been well tamed, would they, if they have the ability to be tamed and then are tamed, would you call them tamed? Oh yeah, then we call them tamed. And what about 2 that have the ability to be tamed but don't get tamed? Would you call them tamed and well disciplined? No. And then he goes on to say, so it's not possible. So it applies the same thing to these 5 factors. These 5 factors are things you can develop. So there are those who develop them and those who don't. And that's the distinction the Buddha wants to make. Everyone has this ability, but he wants to make actually a distinction here between people. Those who develop this capacity all the way to freedom and those who don't. Those who develop the capacity to be honest and those who don't. Those who develop the capacity to avoid doing harmful things and those who don't. And then he goes on to say that, well, if you make a fire from, and he lists 5 different kinds of trees, because back then they rubbed sticks together to make fire. So if you take, oak wood and rub it together, or if you take manzanita wood, or if you take fir, or all these different kinds of trees, and you make a fire, is the fire different with each time? No, it's the same thing. The fire is the same. Same thing. Anybody in the 4 castes, if they actually develop these 5 capacities, they make the same fire, same spiritual fire, the same qualities inside of themselves. And if they develop those things, then there's no distinctions between them that the Buddha thinks is relevant. Elsewhere he goes on, a different sutta, the same kind of idea appears. And then he says, can people in any of the castes kill? Oh yes. But can they not kill? Oh yes, equally. How about taking what's not given? How about stealing and not stealing? How about sexual misconduct and lack of it? How about lying and not lying? How about intoxicating themselves and not They can all do that equally. He says, well, then there's no distinction that's relevant between them. They're all equal. Can everyone develop a heart of loving kindness that's boundless, that includes everyone? And the Buddha says, and they say, yeah, everyone can do that. It doesn't matter what caste you're in. Well, then there's no real relevant distinction between them. So the Buddha is making distinctions between people, but not recognizing any distinction that makes one person superior to another. In terms of their caste, in terms of their race, in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their gender, in terms of their sexual orientation. But how they live and behave ethically and what qualities they develop inside of them, those distinctions have some value for the Buddha. But those distinctions don't separate people into superior and inferior. So that's interesting, maybe. More interesting, I think, is the Buddha actually, just as he gave people instructions in meditation practice, gave people instructions in living an ethical life, he also gave instructions that we should speak up if people are harming others. If people are killing, stealing, lying, involved in sexual misconduct, sexual harm, or causing harm through their intoxication, that not only should we not do that, but we should also speak up and encourage people not to do it. He never said that we should speak up to be oppositional to anyone about it, but we should speak up to point out that this doesn't work, that this is not healthy. And the opposite is so much better. So here the Buddha does make distinctions, but not about who's superior and inferior, but about how people behave. And the behavior of people is the real emphasis the Buddha has. The actions, how we live our life, makes a difference. And we want to speak up. So in our society, we have plenty of people who are killing people literally or killing their spirit. We have lots of situations where in our society in the United States, there's taking what is not given. There was announcements about the climate change stuff, and the amount of taking not given in terms of our consumptions and use of resources. I mean, the resources haven't been given freely. There's often they use the word rape often for pillaging, how strongly the taking of what's not given goes on in our society and in our world. So it doesn't take much to see that there's reason to speak up. But how do we speak up? I think one of the things that Buddhism emphasizes, don't speak up until you've looked at yourself deeply. Understand what's skillful and unskillful. Understand what's healthy and unhealthy in your own heart first. Don't act from your greed. Don't act from your hate. Don't act from delusion. Monitor yourself. Learn about yourself, about how these forces work. Learn to recognize how you get caught in attachments in your social relationships, in your situation in life. Learn how to recognize how you get tense and reactive and judgmental. Learn how to recognize when you're watching a sports game that you've got caught by what the referee has done. And you're not really, you're really attached. And learn to recognize that so that maybe you're not so attached and you can maybe be more, I don't know if impartial is the right word, but more fair and don't have these double standards. So in this training we did, they emphasized this quite a bit, the diversity, and one representative kind of study they told us about, which had a big impact on me. And there's lots of these kinds of studies. It's just one representative of a whole class of studies that come to the same conclusion. It's called the Thomas Meyer study. And they took a bunch of lawyers and offered them some kind of law brief to analyze and consider and to rate from 1 to 5. And this brief had a lot of mistakes in it, 22 mistakes. Some were grammatical, some were legal. But they didn't tell that to the lawyers and said, just read this and then judge it, just rate it from 1 to 5. But then they, as part of all this, they would say to some lawyers that this was written by a black person, and the others, it was written by a white person. But exactly the same document, just different. The racial identity of the author was said to be different. The difference was that when it was a white author, they assumed it was a white author, the score would be 4.1 out of 5. When they assumed it was a black author, the score would be was 3.2 out of 5. What a dramatic difference. This is called implicit bias. I mean, the lawyers weren't thinking about it and they probably weren't aware they were even doing this. But there's so many ways in which we have this kind of bias that operates that's a little bit like the sports team or a little bit like self and other. Part of the training we did was that they emphasized over and over again is that stereotyping others, having bias, is just part and parcel of human life. It just comes with being a human being. The way they wanted to explain it was that this life we live in is so complicated. The mind is a pattern recognizing mind that's going to jump to patterns and make conclusions about how things are without really seeing accurately. If we didn't do that to some degree, we wouldn't find our way in the world. But so everyone has this, but it's possible to become more and more mindful and aware of how this operates within us. And that's the training. And so then when this deep diversity folks talked about the skills that were needed to kind of live wisely in this diverse society, it was like right out of the book for the Dharma practice. I loved it. So, compassion. Accept the existence of bias. Accept that it exists. Have a vision of the possibility of being free of being caught by bias, free of attachments, and have the intention to do so. Catch yourself in the act, which means notice, be mindful to notice how it's operating. And name bias and analyze it. So name it when you see it. Name your own. Analyze it, consider what goes on. Be involved in self-learning. Learn about bias. And that not only your own, but how this works in our society. The social context for it. Because a lot of it is learned also, some of the biases. So to assume that you don't have bias probably means you have more than you realize. Then it was fascinating one is, they're not quite so common in Buddhist circles, this one. This is like where we have the most to learn. The first one seemed fine for us Buddhists, I thought. But the next one is, step into courageous conversations. Buddhists are, on a whole, not any of you maybe, but on the whole, tend to be conflict avoidant. Tend to err on the side of being polite and accepting and peaceful, but courageous conversations. And then the last one is develop relationships. If you really want to work to create a society that is less caught by bias, have a relationship with people, especially people who are on the other sports team. When my son was in Little League here, I sometimes would intentionally go, because the baseball games were, the bleachers were like, there was like the two sides. The parents would sit behind the dugout of their team. So there was parents on one side and parents on the, so I would often go sit on the team from my opposing team my son was on. It was really weird to sit there. But I didn't want to, I wanted to kind of break the divide. And so this exploration of this topic, and to do it in a way that is maybe meaningful, fun, not divisive, is one of the reasons why we've now exploring this deep diversity approach, because there's a lot of divisiveness in the world of diversity, inclusion, and equity. There's a lot of politics, political stances that people take in it that are not really recognized as being political stances. They're just like, this is true and you're wrong, and get on with it, But what this deep diversity does is to remove the divisiveness and recognize everyone's involved in this. And so let's take a deep look at it together. And so, there's limitations to that as well. But this has been a wonderful thing, so that we feel like welcome to step into this in an accepting environment, to really look and have these conversations and consider it, and how do we go forward from here? And so the deep diversity work involved 4 different areas. It was looking at bias itself, recognizing it, understanding the role that emotions have in the influence they have on bias. So that's a rich area, to be mindful of emotions and to understand it. And that also goes along really well with this practice that we do here. And then to take a good look at identity. Identities people have and how we relate to identity, and the fluidity of identity, and how we react to identity, and the respect from it is part of all this. And then power. And they had there's a few wonderful sayings about, one was about power. Because it's the Anima Leadership is the name of the organization. So they focus a lot about leadership. In Buddhism, we like to consider everyone leaders. So it's relevant for everyone to step into this kind of role. But they talked about developing leadership, power, based on caring. So leadership based on caring, not on power. So authority that comes from caring, not from the invested power or social power that people are given. And I love that we come from caring and caring for each other, and from that comes leadership, or comes working. The other thing that a little quote from that organization that I really liked was, if you take sides, who's going to see the whole? If you take side, who's going to see the whole? And in the teachings of the Buddha, he's concerned about the whole. So he said the highest order of kind of how to care for everyone is to care for the welfare and happiness of both self and others, and for our whole community. He was very explicit about this. And not to only care about certain people and not other people. And this gets particularly difficult when there's harm being done. And I was the chair of an ethics committee for many years, for 15 years, I think, 17 years, long time, and had to kind of mediate conflicts that people had. And the approach that I took, which I carefully tried to explain to everyone in conflict, was that I was concerned what was the best for everyone involved. And sometimes people are a little shocked by that, because what about the perpetrator? I mean, yes, I'm really concerned about the best for you. What's best for you? At the same time, what's best for the other person? Let's look for that. Let's find that together. And eventually, everyone seemed to appreciate that. There was value in that. But it really took a lot of work to figure out how that satisfied everybody's needs. But it was an approach that wasn't trying to keep things adversarial, but everyone needs to benefit. Everyone needs to grow. So who looks at the whole? Who cares for everybody involved in a situation? And so this anima organization, this deep diversity, seems to do that. It seems to have that approach in a very nice way. Some people are not going to like it because it's not political enough. and there's these systemic issues in our society that appear to be more political than personal. And they acknowledge that very clearly in their organization. But still, I think their approach to addressing it is something that seems akin or to what we like here, the leadership here at IMC at least likes. And so we finished this. It was a 4-day training we did. It was really, really cool to go through it and have these issues raised and to look at it in an intentional way. And so we're hoping as the months over the next year to introduce this more to the community. I don't think we're going to do this like I'm doing today, a captive audience who has to sit here and listen to me talk about it. But hopefully it wasn't too bad today, because I'm kind of inspired by it. But there'll be opportunities to sign up for different programs, different kind of simple things we're doing to offer this training and exploration in our community. And the leadership, some of the teachers and some of the teacher trainees and other leaders, board members and different people are excited by this and are investing their time and efforts to be able to bring this into our community. So some of you will have the option, all of you have the option to be part of this if you'd like. One of the odd things about IMC is that we are a very poorly defined community. That's both a strength and a weakness. And I like the strength part of it. It means that it's open to anyone who comes. And if you want to be a member of IMC, just by wanting it, you are. And if you're a kind of person who doesn't like membership in organizations, well, we don't have membership. That's fine. You can come anyway. So it's kind of like very, hopefully fluid. So participate as it works for you and what's nice for you. But we'll be doing this. And some of you, if you find this interesting, what I've said today, you might think about reading the book, The Deep Diversity. It's been a very wonderful book for us. And it's one of the values of choosing it is that it gives us as a community an opportunity to have shared vocabulary, shared concepts to find our way with. And to have that shared is really helpful because if it just makes things easier to have conversations and to understand. So, there's tea today, so everyone's welcome to stay and set up out there, and many of us go outside in the parking lot afterwards. And what I like to do when there's tea day is if you don't mind staying an extra couple of minutes just shortly and introduce yourself to a couple of people next to you with some sense that sometimes someone's left there alone, everyone turns the other direction. Look around and make sure everyone's included because inclusion is important. And say hello, and even if it's your first time here at IMC, you're now someone who can welcome person you're with. Welcome each other here and say hello, and if there's something invaluable or interesting that came out of this talk I gave, if you want to share with your friend, that'd be fine, but it's enough just say hello, introduce yourself, and I look forward to seeing you at the tea. Thank you.